happy Women's History Month, everyone. This is our first Women's History Month of the event of the year, and we're so happy to be with you today and be with our our great friend of DA, Dr. Maria Esther Hammack, and of course, our Global Black Caucus Chair, Adrian George. Thank you both for being here today. Thanks to everybody who's here today. Um, Maria is going to talk to us about the the talk of the title of her talk is She Made Freedom Her Business: Routes Out of the US Slavery in the Antebellum. So Maria is a Mexican scholar whose work bridges the histories of abolition and Black liberation that shaped North America. She is currently the co-pi of the Mellon Foundation
No,
grant
because
centered.
Angela, I had to ask Maria last time what the copi means. Maria, what is that?
Oh, so I'm the co-principal investigator of a Mellon grant that works with Afro-Indigenous and Afro-Mexican descendants.
No, that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And she's here to give us another great piece of history. So welcome, Maria, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen. I did change the title a little bit in commemoration of the women that I'll be talking about, but also in commemoration of Women's History Month. And I think it applies because one of the um, arguments I bring to the table is that when we learn of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad to Mexico, we should be learning about these women who also engineered channels of liberation to Mexican spaces. A lot of the time, these histories are disconnected or disjointed. They're not really taught in tandem. And I argue that it is consequential to make sure that when we learn about Black freedom in Canada, we should be learning about Black freedom in Mexico as well. Those histories, particularly the hidden histories of women who led these railroads north, south, east, or west, they are consequential and they shaped they shaped and link North America together, and therefore not only the histories of the three countries are linked, but the histories of Black liberation are connected. And so today I'm going to highlight two women, and I'm going to sort of try to go into depth about their experiences and the importance of resituating their stories and into the popular narratives that we hear and that we read, even when a lot of these women, particularly two of these women that I'm going to highlight today, are not in history books per se. But I hope that they will be, with the work that I'm doing and with the work that descendants are doing on the ground as well, to make sure that these histories are not lost and that they are told and shared and that everybody learns the names of these women. And so the first is I'm going to start with the story of a woman by the name of Sylvia Hector Weber. And I wanted to start with this because um, the whole idea of her being situated as a Harriet Tubman was not necessarily something that I intentionally created. We had been working with descendants of Sylvia Hector through the Mellon grant that we had, and the story got media attention a couple years ago, mainly because when I was doing research as a graduate student, was recovering the story of Sylvia, and I came across these documents that are her freedom papers. And so with finding those documents, and I'll show you those documents in a few minutes, but when I found those documents, I was able to learn so much more about the woman that I was researching, this phenomenal individual who was the first free Black woman to settle Central Texas. She was the first Black woman that lived in the vicinity of Austin, Texas. And nobody really talked about her. There was no biography on her. So I did take it upon myself to write her first ever biography. And in that process, I found her Freedom Papers. And when I found her Freedom Papers, I was able to finish that biography and get it published because there was a lot of information in that that told me more about her experience in slavery and freedom, told me more about her family, about her first three children. And so I was able to contextualize a lot more than I would have if I hadn't found her Freedom Papers. So I got that published. And when it was published, her descendants reached out to me and they wanted to know more. I mean, they knew of her, but they really didn't know much. They've never seen the Freedom Papers. They actually didn't even know that there were any Freedom Papers available, and they really, wanted to see them. They wanted to learn. And so I took groups, and I also showed you some of the pictures that I have, some of groups of the descendants to the archives where I found those records. And they were able to see those records for the first time. And so when that happened, the archive actually, it was a complex process that took several years, but out of that first initial um, encounter of descendants with the Freedom Papers at the archive, they began working together with the archive to develop a very small exhibit. And I'll show you a picture. It was very small, but still it was very significant for the descendants to be able to have a commemoration of this woman in a little archive featuring her papers front and center. And it was very meaningful for the descendants. And I won't tell you the story of the descendants because that's their story to tell. But in my perspective, as a historian, as a scholar, as a student, as an educator, that was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, to be able to connect descendants to these records, but also to be able to be part of that exhibit that we were able to collaborate on. So based on that exhibit, what you see on the screen, the exhibit got traction in national and international news. People were excited to read about this woman. And the Today Show reached out to the descendants, and they interviewed some of the descendants. You might find the video online. Feel free to Google it. I might be able to send you the link. And so the Today Show did a story. They went to the Rio Grande Valley, where her ranch is, where her cemetery, when she's buried. They did a story, and they featured that on the Today Show, but then also the journalist that was working with the Today Show ended up writing about the story, and she interviewed me and she contextualized it. It was a beautiful article that you can also find online. I'm happy to share it as well. And in that, the title was this: Did you know Texas had its own Harriet Tubman, who helped enslave Black people to Mexico? And so far, for the longest time, I had been situating these stories as making this case, and maybe I had mentioned it to the journalist that interviewed me. But I've always mentioned that when we learn about Harriet Tubman, we should be learning about all these other women that fought for freedom in that context. And so the title just brought that up and say, we need to be learning about Harriet Tubman and all these other women as well. And so this particular article created a lot of controversy, if you will. And there were a lot of people that were endorsing it and embracing the story and saying, yes, we need to learn about Sylvia. We need to contextualize her story. But there are also individuals who were completely against it, saying that by utilizing Harriet Tubman in the story, we were taking something away from Harriet Tubman. We were dishonoring her story or her fight, and that we were basically taking something away. And so I wanted to start with this conversation by saying that it is important to highlight women like Sylvia in this context, but we are not trying, and the descendants and myself as a scholar are not trying to take anything away from Harriet Tubman. But I think it's beautiful when we are able to link the stories of empowering women who shaped and changed our histories. And in the context of Harriet Tubman and Sylvia Hector Weber, both women shaped Black liberation in North America. Harriet Tubman did it in a big way. She led countless of people to freedom in Canada. She fought in the Civil War. And no one could ever take anything away from Harriet Tubman. But Sylvia also needs to be highlighted as someone who fought for freedom. She fought for her own freedom first, for the freedom of her family, just like Harriet Tubman, because she also fought for her family's freedoms, and she fought to help others to Mexican freedom throughout the rest of her life, and through Texas into Mexico. And I think, it's important to acknowledge the stories of these empowering women and see what we can find, and how we can connect these consequential aspects that have been little known. And so if you want to read more on this article and where this comes from, feel free. I also have, there is a scholar by the name of Jasma Sutton who's written about the importance of acknowledging Harriet Tubman and propelling her story, but also at the same time, simultaneously, ensuring that all other women who have been little known are also buttressed and supported and made visible. And so I wanted to start with this just because I didn't want to create confusion. She has been called the Harriet Tubman, but I think her story is different. But in the same context, it does highlight powerful stories of Black women who challenged the institution of slavery and shaped our collected histories. So that's I hope that's a good intro on that. But Sylvia is a woman who, and I have, in the last time that I talked, I highlighted the processes of Mexican freedom. I highlighted a lot of the women who made these processes who enabled these processes to Mexico, how they engineered those journeys south through their resistance, how they actually physically moved down, how they legally fought for freedom, how they intellectually shaped freedom processes through Mexico. And so today I wanted to narrow down and talk about the story of Sylvia and one other woman as well. And so Sylvia was born in West Florida. And at the time, the borderlands have changed so much in the past, 300 years. West Florida was what today is Baton Rouge. So she was actually born in that area. She was born enslaved and sold a few times. And we did find her. It has been a challenge finding her records, and piecing together her story. But we do know that she was born there around 1807 in the area of Baton Rouge, right by the Mississippi River. And we do know that her mother's name was Sarah. And we have here a record where you see Sarah, who was 26 years old, and her daughter Sylvia, who was 8. Now, this is a record that took me several years to find. I started writing and researching the story of Sylvia in 2017, and I didn't find this until 2023. And for the longest time, I knew that she and her mother had been separated by sale. I did not know what her mother's name was, but when I found this record, it was outstanding. It was an outstanding feeling to be able to find her mother's name on the record alongside hers. So Sarah was 26 years old and Sylvia was 8 when they were sold away, and they weren't sold together. Sarah was sold to someone else and Sylvia was sold to another person. So they were separated at that time. And so it is unimaginable today for many of us to be separated and sold away from your family. And Sylvia persevered. We don't know much of what happened to Sarah. We do believe that she may have been sold away to somewhere in Mississippi. We're not really sure. The descendants are continuing that work today to find more of where Sarah ended up. And she was 26 years old, and we're sure that she was sold somewhere else and continue laboring enslaved. Sylvia, however, was sold to this man, or was sold and bought by this man by the name of Silas McDaniels, who was a large slaveholder who hailed from North Carolina, and at some point he was in transit between Louisiana and the Missouri Territory. And so this man takes Sylvia to the Missouri Territory and sells her again. So Sylvia is sold a couple times in that period between 1816 to 1819. Sylvia is sold and taken to the Missouri Territory, and she is sold to a man named Morgan Cryer. He had been a veteran of the Revolution of the War of 1812, and he was originally from the Carolinas. He ends up in um, traveling through many different places, but he ends up settling one of these settlers that moved from the eastern seaboard into what was the Missouri Territory at that point. And so Sarah ends up enslaved and laboring in the Missouri Territory, particularly in a place called Clark County, that later becomes, after the 1830s, I believe, Clark County, even though at that point in 1819, when Sylvia arrives in the Missouri Territory, Clark County is part of that Missouri Territory. But at some point, that place shifts and becomes Clark County, Arkansas. And so this is important to acknowledge that as Sylvia moves through these geographies were ever changing and shifting and changing hands, because there were three empires vying for power of these spaces. We have the British Empire, we have the Spanish Empire, and we have the Anglos, the U.S. Imperial powers trying to wrestle these spaces from these were native spaces, right? But back to Sylvia. So she was brought to Clark County, the Missouri Territory, where she labored in the plantation of Morgan Cryer. And so we do know that she arrives in 1819 in Missouri Territory. Now she labors for several years between 1819 and 1826. Sylvia is in Clark County, enslaved, forced to work the plantation. And then as she's laboring there, Mexico has claimed independence. And the Texas province is part of Mexico, and Mexico opens up a call for settlers. And they invite any Anglo settlers from the United States, from the territories of Missouri, to move. And Mexico was willing to offer them land grants and such. And so while Sarah's owner, enslaver, did not move, his son did. His son was one of the 300 individuals. I don't know if many of you are from Texas or have heard of Texas history, the famous 300 people that moved to Mexican Texas to settle. And so Sylvia's enslaver's son moves to Texas in 1826 and brings with him 5 enslaved individuals. And Sylvia was one of those 5 who arrives in the Austin colonies. And I'll show you a little map where the Austin colony was. And so she arrives in Mexican Texas in 1826. Now, at this time, Mexican Texas had abolished slavery, had not abolished slavery, but they had abolished the introduction of slaves into the new Republic of Mexico. So after 1824, after July 13th of 1824, the introduction of slaves into Mexican territory was unlawful. But nevertheless, this man, John Cryer, brought Sylvia and 4 others into Mexican Texas. And by law, she should have been freed at the mere action of setting foot on Mexican territory, but her enslaver does not free her. And but she continues to fight for that freedom between 1826 and 1834. There's a lot of things that happened to Sylvia in this period in Mexican Texas. As I mentioned, she never received her freedom, but she found ways to navigate enslavement and fight it in Mexican Texas. At some point, it is believed between 1828 and 1829, she comes across or encounters a white man from Vermont who it's very important to highlight that a lot of the times, men entered into relationships with enslaved women who were not necessarily or were not at all consensual. And this is something that happened to Sylvia. She, experienced this violence of not being able to choose or decide upon her own body, being an enslaved woman or being considered an enslaved woman. This man, she ends up having 3 children with this man by the name of John Weber. This man did not own her. This man was a neighbor of the man who owned her. And we do see in records how she utilized this very violent relationship, because it does start in violence. And but she's able to navigate it in such a way. And there's scholars that talk about how Black women navigated, particularly when they were enslaved, these processes. And if anybody's interested in this work, her name is Brenda Stevenson, and she has written about this very complex, violent relationships that Black women had to navigate during this period of enslavement. And Sylvia did navigate that. So between 1829 and 1834, she had 3 children with this neighbor of her enslaver. And part of that negotiation, she's able to secure her freedom in 1834. So when you see the freedom papers that I'll show you in a few minutes, it is very clear that when the freedom papers are drafted, it is her freedom that is purchased, not her body or herself. So when you see the freedom papers, the man that she had children by never actually owned her. And it's the records that exist are very complex, but they highlight the many ways that Sylvia was able to navigate that experience and be able to secure her freedom, not only for herself, but also for her children. Here, I just wanted to show you, this is one of the records that I have from where she was taken to the Missouri Territory, the county of Clark, right here, the county of Clark, Missouri Territory, and this is Sylvia's name. And so it's been, as I mentioned, very hard to find a lot of her story, but little by little, by the records that I've been able to find and locate, her story has come together. And so this is the Freedom Papers, and this is her right here. She was able to secure her freedom, Sylvia, and her three children. The first children is Alcy, aged 5, Henry, aged 18 months, and John, aged 1 month. So as you see, her freedom papers showcase or highlight a lot more than I actually knew before I found them about how she secured her freedom. So it's clear that through her freedom papers, she made sure that her children were also freed in these records. And so by 1834, she secures her freedom and the freedom of her 3 children, her oldest, and then she moves out of her enslaver's home. And she joins this man, the white man that I mentioned, that entered into this violent relationship with her. She ends up moving with him. We don't really know the nature of that relationship at that time. This was 1834, but records that I found from her later life, she remained with him for the rest of her life. And I'll tell you more about that story. And but in 1834, they moved out, and they moved out of where the Austin colonies were. They had to move to the edge of that colony, because at that time, it was not, particularly in the Austin colonies, they didn't really see these interracial relationships in a good light. And so they had to move as far away as they could from that area and establish themselves. So Sylvia was free, and she was the first free Black woman to live in that area of Weberville. So they moved to that area that today is actually named Weberville for John Weber, the man that became Sylvia's husband. There are numerous records that I found where she mentions at some point later in life that they got married by a Mexican priest, in the 1830s. I've never found her marriage license, but she does say that they had, and then she ends up, and I'll tell you a little more about her story later, but she is recognized as his wife, and when he dies in the 1890s, she is recognized as his widow, and she ends up receiving his pension for the military service that he did in the War of 1812. So it is clear that there was, well, we don't know what kind of relationship they had at this time, and that the relationship began as a violent one. We do know that by the end of their lives, they were still together, and she is listed as his wife, as his widow, in many of the later records that I've been able to find about her. But the Freedom Papers are in and of themselves very interesting documents that I wanted to showcase to you all. First, the fact that she secured her freedom in her first three children. But the second, I also wanted to highlight a little interesting aspect of this, of the violence of slavery that are in these records. So the enslaver that Sylvia's former enslaver, he did not want, so when she negotiates her freedom with the help of this white man, John Weber, her enslaver says, sure, fine, you can buy your freedom, but I don't want money. He does not ask for money. He asked a very unusual request, and unusual in the context of I've never seen other records like this. I have heard that this was, something that happened, but I've never actually seen this. But her enslaver did not want money or silver or gold. He wanted Sylvia to pay him with two children. He wanted a child, a girl that was under, I think, under 3 years of age, a girl under 3, and then he wanted a boy under the age of 2. This is an unusual request for payment. Now, when I read these records, when I first encountered them, I could not conceive that someone who had been born enslaved, that someone who was separated from her own mother at 8 years old and sold away from her mother, I did not conceive that someone like Sylvia would ever want to make that payment. She would never pay in human life, in human children. But I wasn't sure. And this was, when I encountered the records was in 2018. It took me until 2024 to find a record that proved that Sylvia never made that payment. And I'll tell you a little bit about that story in a few minutes. But the Freedom Papers are just very interesting records. There's a lot of emancipation documents, wills that free people, but freedom papers like this are hard to come by. And so I invite you to read them if you are interested in reading them completely. I have a transcription, but also they are available at the archive, where they are located at the Briscoe Center for American History in Austin, Texas. They have actually digitized these records because the family, the descendants, have asked, to make them accessible. So if you want the link, I'm happy to share that link as well. Now, a little bit about Sylvia. Remember I told you guys that she had to move. So I wanted to give you this map where this is the Austin colonies. Everything that is in gray, that was the Austin colonies. A lot of the times when we think about Texas history and the Anglo settlements and the Texas colonies, people think that that all of Texas was the Texas colonies, but that was not true. All of Texas was Mexico. The Texas colonies were confined to this gray area. If you see, this is where the Austin colony or Austin's colony was. Now, this Texas, present day Austin, Texas is right here, where I'm putting my little arrow. Somewhere about here, that's where Austin, Texas is. San Antonio is over here. And where I put the mark, the red star, that's where Sylvia and her husband and their first 3 children moved to when they left San Felipe. So she purchased, she negotiated her freedom right here. That's where she was enslaved. And they had to move all the way to the edge of that colony because they couldn't live inside the colony as a free Black woman. She couldn't live inside the colony as a free Black woman. So they settled here in the frontier. They built their ranch. They had a ferry along the Colorado River. And there's a lot of records that I've found. And actually here, this picture, it's my own photo when I went to the site of where her ferry was. I'm standing, sort of taking a picture to the side of where her ferry was right here. And this is the Colorado River of Texas. Now, don't get it confused. There's two Colorado rivers in the United States. One is the Grand Canyon, but there's a Colorado River in Texas as well. And so, and it flows like this. So you see, this is the Colorado River that goes down here. And this is just a mark of where it goes from Austin, from Weberville. It goes all the way to Matagorda. Now, records that I have found have highlighted that even when Sylvia moved to this area in the frontier, established her ranch, she was always helping people. She was not all, there's records that show that she harbored people. Like there was a young girl that had gotten pregnant and their parents had shunned her, and she welcomed her into her home, helped her deliver the baby, and she lived with them and helped her out on the ranch. She was also known to help runaway slaves around that area. And then her and her husband will ferry them to freedom all the way down the Colorado River, down to the Gulf. And so they did this work in Central Texas for many, many years until 1851. They lived and settled Weberville. Today, Weberville continues to have their name. And if you go to Weberville today, which is about 16 miles southeast of Austin, Texas, if you go to that area, there is a church in that vicinity that was established much, much later. But there's a plaque, there's a historical marker. When I was doing research for her story, I looked at the historical marker, and then I was very confused because in the marker, her husband was situated as, John Weber, blah blah blah. The historical marker has stuff on her husband, but she's only mentioned as the former slave. There's no name. The historical marker does not bear her name. And when I saw that, that's when I decided to write a biography on her, because there's a lot of biographies on John Weber. All the historical markers highlight John Weber, and none of them highlight Sylvia. There were no biographies on Sylvia, so that's what prompted me to write and to research and write about Sylvia, and why I published that first her biography. And so because her story wasn't told, she was not even mentioned. There's at least 3 historical markers that mention her either as the Black wife or the former slave. Her name is not on there. But we're trying to change that. I'm part of this organization. As I mentioned, I've been working with descendants who are recovering more of her story, and they have applied for historical markers that have been approved. So soon, in the next year or so, hopefully, according to, depending on what the administration does, a lot of these histories that we're doing and that I'm doing are not necessarily welcomed in this era. In the grand context of historical markers, the NPS is having a hard time getting a lot of this processed, but at least they are approved, and hopefully there would be markers with her name in the near future. But I wanted to showcase this to say, she was the first free Black woman to live in Central Texas, in the vicinity of Austin. Austin, Texas is just right here. And at a time when most of the people that were brought into the Austin colony were enslaved, despite Mexican law. Again, Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, 30 years before the United States. And so Sylvia certainly experienced this space, this geography, in a very different, various ways. She was in this between slavery and freedom. She was free, but this place was had a lot of these contentions. There were a lot of people that were trying to escape slavery, and that's how she became involved. As people kept running through the Colorado River, they would get to her house, and then she and her family would ferry them down down the Colorado River and into Matagorda. And she did that until the 1850s, when she was actually forced out of Central Texas. So by that time, she establishes herself. She makes sure that her children are educated. She brings in and hires a school teacher who lives in their ranch, and she has 11 children with John Weber, and all of them are educated. All of them have been are being taught to read and write and mathematics, everything we do have those records. And they start receiving a lot of threats because of the fact that they were free Black people, and that they were being teaching their children to read and write, that they were helping people to freedom, that they were harboring runaway slaves. They received a lot of death threats. In spite, they remained until 1851. Remember those Freedom Papers when I said that I could not conceive that she would ever pay in human beings? In 1851, the former enslaver lodges a lawsuit against Sylvia and John, and goes to the Austin, Texas, Travis County courthouse and says, these people have not paid me, and I'm going to sue them because I need my payment. Since 1834 to 1851, Sylvia and John never paid him, but now they were being sued for that payment. Of course, they were not going to pay in human beings in 1851 either. They didn't do it in 1834. They were not going to do it in 1851. So, but the Freedom Papers were very explicit. There was, if they didn't pay, they would forfeit their land in Weberville. So in 1851, they had to forfeit all of their land in Weberville. And that's when they moved to Mexico. They end up in Tamaulipas, Mexico. So from 1851, they move, and by 1852, they were living in Tamaulipas, Mexico. And we found records, the descendants actually recently found records of them in Tamaulipas, that I'm not going to highlight because, this is the descendants' stories to tell about those records and what they found. And I hope you keep in tune, because they have a nonprofit today called the Weber Family Preservation Project. You can look online. This is part of the Mellon grant that I'm a principal investigator of. And I'm just supporting the descendants to be able to reclaim and retell these stories. So, but we do know that they went to Mexico and they lived there until 1852. From 1851 to 1852. In 1853, they moved back across the Rio Grande into what is now Hidalgo County, Texas. And I'll have this map right here. So they were living here in Central Texas. When they forfeited their land at Weberville, they moved down here. They moved down here to Tamaulipas, and then they moved by 1853 back. They bought land here, which is called the Weber Ranch. And their cemetery is still standing in that area in Hidalgo County. And that picture that I have here is actually me standing where the cemetery is behind me, and this is the view of the Rio Grande River from what used to be her land and her home. Of course, her descendants at some point sold the land, but the cemetery remains today in the hands of her descendants. Sophia Weber is today one of the descendants that caretakes for the cemetery. What I do have to highlight is, they moved to Mexico. A lot of their children grew up, and by the second generation, most of their children were identifying as Mexican. And so you start hearing, a lot of the descendants have, Mexican last names. Some of them still live in Mexico. We have been able to locate other descendants that were, from the Louisiana side. And that's part of the work that the Mellon grant is funding to bring together more of her descendants. But again, that is work that descendants should be able to highlight. And I hope that you'll get to learn more about that. We are having the descendants are putting up a symposium, and of course, as a historical advisor, I'm supporting that and helping organize it in July. So if anybody's going to be in Texas, in Austin, Texas, I invite you to come and learn more from the descendants on the work that they're doing to recover Sylvia's legacy furthermore. But so A little bit more about Sylvia's experience on the Rio Grande River in her ranch, both in Tamaulipas and in Hidalgo County. So when she removes from Central Texas and goes to Mexico, they live there. Then they buy land in Hidalgo County. They move to Hidalgo County. And then this is 1853. By 1859, we all know the Civil War breaks out. And because all this time, Sylvia keeps helping people, not only when she lived in Central Texas, in the Rio Grande River, she harbors people that are trying to escape to Mexico and she ferries them to freedom across the Rio Grande. She does that work all the way through the Civil War. And but because she was doing this work, her and her family were ferrying people to freedom. She gets uh, labeled as an unionist and as an abolitionist by the Confederacy. They ran her out of her ranch. Two of her children are caught by the Confederacy and jailed by the Confederate Fort, who held the Confederate forces in South Texas. These are the two oldest children. They do manage to escape, so they didn't remain in jail. They managed to escape and went and joined her in Mexico. But she uprooted and went to Mexico when the Civil War broke out, because she didn't want her daughters and her children to be to face the Confederacy's wrath. And so she moves, but by the 1870s, after emancipation, after 1865, she comes back to the ranch and she lives until the end of her days right here in Hidalgo County. And today she is buried at the Weber Cemetery in South Texas. And a lot of her descendants, have been able to go to the cemetery. They're trying to preserve the cemetery. In 2020, the cemetery was being threatened by the border wall that was being built in the first administration of our current president. And the cemetery, the historic cemetery, was threatened by the wall. The wall was going to cut off access to the ranch. But the descendants got together, had several meetings with the border, the DSH, and sent several petitions. They did a lot of important work, and they were able to prevent that the wall from cutting access to the cemetery. So today they're fine. You can go to the cemetery. They can go to the cemetery. People actually can visit. And the descendants are also trying to make sure that the cemetery is accessible. They are working on having tours of the cemetery, as well as ground penetrating radar to locate Sylvia's grave, because they don't really know exactly where her grave was. A lot of the graves are old or unreadable. And that is part of the work that they're doing today. Descendants have taken upon themselves to recover more of her story. And they're doing a great job. So I hope that you keep in tune with that. And I think in the next few years, we'll know a lot more about Sylvia and her descendants. I did want to show you this picture because I did mention at the beginning of the talk that when I first connected with the descendants, I took a few groups to go see the Freedom Papers at the archive. And that out of that initial interaction, even though the process was long and complex, they were able to work with the archive to set up a small exhibit. And I meant a small exhibit. The exhibit was basically this box. Her Freedom Papers are right here. And so these are Sylvia's descendants. And today they're from different branches. You see different branches. And today they're trying to find more descendants. There's a lot of things that they don't know. They've never met each other before. They've never even, they knew, where to find each other. But because of her Freedom Papers, they've been able to connect. And the work that they're doing with the melon and to recover those legacies. They just did a symposium in Hidalgo County at the Museum of South Texas History in February 6th. And there was a panel of it were 6 descendants on a panel from different branches of Sylvia's children. Remember, Sylvia had 11 children. And so most of them, the descendancy is very broad and very large. And today they're this is the first time where they met and looked at her freedom papers officially in an exhibit site. And so keep posted for more on what their descendants are doing. I think they're trying to also try to identify more descendants and more branches. There's a few children that we don't know what happened to them. Out of the 11, I have been able to highlight at least 5 groups of descendants, but some children left, some children passed at some point, because some of them were light-skinned. John Weber was a white man. One of her, Alcy, who is in the Freedom Papers, she ends up passing and leaves the area and moves. We don't really know what happened to Alcy. We do know that she moved somewhere to another county and perhaps later to Louisiana. And so there's a few children that we don't know what happened to them, but we know that perhaps their descendants are somewhere, and hopefully the descendants that are working on this will find and meet many, many other descendants of Sylvia. But to conclude, I did want to highlight another experience that I think is outstanding, and it was an amazing record to find. Often when we hear about stories of Black women who are particularly doing this work, taking people to freedom or moving to Mexico, right, or themselves, it's either by finding records like the Freedom Papers, by finding records from enslavers, and bills of sale, etc. But seldom do we actually find records where Black women tells us about their experiences crossing into Mexico. And so this is the story of Becky Simmons. And she's a woman who crossed the Rio Grande River, the Rio Grande River, on July 13th of 1850. She was part of this group of 700 people who were called today, were called the Black Seminoles, who crossed the Rio Grande from Texas into Mexico to escape re-enslavement and persecution. So a little bit of their story before I contextualize Becky Simmons' story. The Black Seminoles had been hailing from Florida. They're groups of Black and Seminole people that joined forces to fight imperialism, to fight enslavement, to fight the forces of Andrew Jackson. We all learn in some ways the story of the Trail of Tears, where Indigenous Americans were pushed out of their lands in Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas, and they were forced to reservations in Oklahoma and the West, right? Well, the Black Seminoles are part of that story. There were people enslaved that were part of the Trail of Tears. There were people, Black Indigenous people that were part of those stories, including the Black Seminoles, who are Afro-Indigenous individuals. And so they were removed along, because of Andrew Jackson's policies in the 1830s, and moved into places like Oklahoma and other places north of Texas as well. A lot of these groups in Oklahoma were facing re-enslavement, or they were facing, particularly if they were Black or Afro-Indigenous, they could be labeled as runaways, and they were being re-enslaved. Indigenous communities were facing harsh realities in reservations. And so this group of Black Seminoles realized that they did not want to live in Oklahoma. They did not want to stay in the reservations, and they wanted to try and see if they could fare better in Mexico. So at first, a group of leaders, particularly a Seminole leader by the name of Wildcat and a Black Seminole leader by the name of John Horse, go and scope things out in Mexico. They go all the way to Mexico City, have an audience with the president of Mexico, and say, hey, we're here. We want to know what kind of freedom we can have here in Mexico, and what will you offer us if we come? We're willing to work. We're willing to fight. We're willing to do whatever to be free. And so they negotiate with the Mexican government, and in exchange of allegiance to the Mexican Republic, and in exchange for, if If Mexico ever needs fighters, you will be fighters. In exchange of that allegiance to fight, they received land in a few states in the north, including Coahuila. Importantly, they received citizenship, Mexican citizenship. And there is, I think I have it right here. They received, before I go back to Becky Simmons' story, here is where they received citizenship. This is part of that decree that was secured by John Horse and Wildcat in October. Remember, Becky Simmons crossed in July. By October, they had received official approval for their lands, including Article 15 of those negotiations. They say that they would be considered Mexican citizens. So the Black Seminoles received Mexican citizenship as well. And so this is the story that contextualizes Becky Simmons' story. Part of the land grants that Mexico gave these groups of Black Seminoles were in north, in the state of Coahuila and Durango. The largest land grant that they received was El Nacimiento, that is El Nacimiento de los Negros. It is still standing today, and it's still owned by the descendants of these groups who asked for these lands in 1850. And so Becky Simmons, in July 13th of 1850, was moving across to move to that area in Coahuila. And so I'll read you what she says. And so this is one of those few excerpts that we get the experiences or the voices directly from Black women who experience this crossing. And Becky Simmons, we do have this because in the 1930s, there's this scholar by the name of Kenneth Porter, who went down to these communities in Mexico in the 1930s and interviewed all of the elders. And Becky Simmons was an elder at that time, and that's, she gave her testimony and her experience. And so I know we all have heard about the WPA narratives. We have those all across, but this historian, Kenneth Porter, went all the way to Mexico to make sure that their stories were preserved. And so I'll read you this excerpt from Becky Simmons, what she says. She says, "Now we were glad that we were going to get away from the American race people, and we felt that we could be safe if we can get across the river. Our men look around with Wildcat. Remember, I told you the Wildcat was one of the leaders. With Wildcat for a place to ford the river. It was dark in about the middle of the night, so that we had to be hurrying and get through with the crossing. But the hours looked like 10 years, for we were so close to the American race people that we wanted to get away across the river soon. Soon Wildcat said that he found a good place. We, the women and children, crossed the river first, then the men crossed after us. There was a skiller made out of 3 logs, so skiller boats were made of logs, tied together, which we crossed on. It was a good ride, for the men took long sticks to guide the traption across the river. And in the last part, she does mention that briefly that it was she will never forget. She says her last part is like, I will never forget what that felt like. And so I wanted to showcase this to offer you a primary source that really recovers the voice of this woman and what it felt like for her and for many of the countless of people who crossed that river in pursuit of freedom, in pursuit of better lives. And sometimes we often forget that these stories exist because they're little known. Today, we hear a lot of the stories of what's going on in the border, people crossing the other way around. But if we think that less than 200 years ago, people were going in the opposite direction, perhaps our understanding could be more broad. And perhaps we can find solutions to the problems of our today if we highlight stories like Becky Simmons and what it meant for her to cross and why she crossed at this time. Becky Simmons lived in Mexico for the rest of her life. She was an elderly woman by the 1930s, and she was still living in Coahuila, Mexico. And this is today, El Nacimiento is still the largest land, but there's a lot of other of the smaller land grants where still people live from descendants of these communities. And one thing that I want to highlight, and I'm here right here with some of the members of the community. I have been to several of their festivals. They have festivals every year, including and importantly, El Nacimiento de los Negros is the only Mexican place where Juneteenth has been celebrated since the 1870s. And they celebrate Juneteenth in El Nacimiento because when Juneteenth happened in Texas, a lot of the people that were living in El Nacimiento were, yes, people from these communities, but throughout the years, people from these communities welcomed runaway slaves from Texas. And so when 1865 happened and Juneteenth happened in Texas, the Black Seminoles celebrated. The Mascogos, they call themselves Mascogos in Mexico. And they celebrated and they started their celebrations in the 1870s and they have continued to today. So every year on Juneteenth, you can go to El Nacimiento and be part of their festivals and festivities. And so with that, I wanted to leave you with these two incredible stories that highlight Black women and how they made their way and crafted, as I say, or as I said, engineered channels of liberation to Mexican spaces. And I hope you enjoyed, and I'm here now to, if anybody has any questions or comments, I'm here to answer them for you.
Wow, what an incredible story, Maria. That is amazing. I you every time you visit us, you teach us something about our history that I'm sure a lot of people didn't know. And I really appreciate that. I looked at the website for this family, the Weber family,
Mhm.
and yeah, I'm actually going to sign up for their mailing list because I'd like to
Yes. And
I
go to
would
their
like to keep it up.
go to their Facebook. They also post a lot of they post a lot more on Facebook of what they're doing than on the website. They're still, figuring out how to make sure that the website works. But
Yeah.
Facebook, they'll keep you posted on symposiums. Um, they travel to archives together to, research. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, Adrian, what did you think?
Well, as you said, we weren't getting this in our education in the States, and I am grateful that you joined us the second time. I had a question, and I don't know if maybe somebody else felt this, but we always talk about papers, as part of our history as Black people. You have to have your papers. And this thing that's going on with ICE, Dr. Hammack, I know you said we could call you Maria. Is there
Maria,
anything,
call me Maria. Yes.
and I appreciate that, but we love seeing you and calling you Dr. Hammack, but Maria, I appreciate that. Can you give us like a modern day parallel about what's going on with ICE and everything and people that look like us having to walk around with papers? Like what, for me, with that, I just can't help thinking now we still can't walk around without papers.
In 200 years, things haven't changed. People are still crossing rivers. People still have to hold their papers. And I mean, Sylvia, we have these records. While we don't really know, I don't really know if these were Sylvia's papers. I have a feeling sometimes as historians I get like, the feeling I knew when I realized I was like, there is no way Sylvia ever made that payment. I just had a feeling. I couldn't prove it until last year when I found the records. But I had the feeling. So I have the same feeling. I have a feeling that these records were Sylvia's. And if these records were Sylvia's, she must have been required to carry them everywhere she moved across Texas. Otherwise, anyone could say, oh, she's a runaway and be re-enslaved. Anyone who had freedom papers had to carry them with them at
Yeah.
every crossing, at every space.
And
Well,
that
to
thought to me is so, Angela, what do you feel about that? That thought to me is just so horrific. And what if you lost them or somebody took them from you
yeah,
and
I
I feel
mean, it's disquieting, but honestly, ICE has felt like slave catchers the whole time for me. Not people call them the brown shirts, but it's more like slave catchers to
Yeah.
me.
It is. It is. Thank you, Angela, for saying that because I felt the same way. I think, and there's even in pictures, and I don't know, there's a photo, maybe it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago in the in the first administration. Um, there were Haitian immigrants crossing the river, and the Texas Rangers met a lot of them on horseback and there's pictures that this journalist took with these Texas Rangers on horses
Mm,
with the lash. It looked like a lash. I don't know what it was, but it looked like slave hunt. They looked like slave hunters. And it was a famous picture. You can Google it, but it was at that moment when I saw that, I was like, this is that tradition of slave hunting that the Texas Rangers were born out of, because that's a story that hasn't been told. The first slave hunters, all of the first Texas Rangers were slave hunters. They began
mhm.
as a policing organization to catch enslaved people who had escaped to Mexico. And there are a lot of them in the work that I've done. I think I showed this last year where slave hunters were being hired to cross, mind you, to cross the river illegally and go into Mexico to retrieve and kidnap people that had been living free there already. And
Dr. Maria, I'm so
yeah,
sorry. Did I hear you correctly and say that the only reason that the Texas Rangers exist was to catch enslaved people who were seeking freedom?
the first iteration, so the first so when the Texas Ranger were officially constituted, all of the first Texas Rangers who became the first Texas Rangers had been slave hunters. All of them.
Yeah.
Every single one in that first Texas Ranger force, they were all slave hunters.
Okay, so I didn't say it exactly correct. So
Okay.
the Texas Rangers weren't formed to catch slaves, but all the ones that were the original, the initial group had that history, that background, that experience of being slave. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Not that that makes me feel better, but
Yeah.
thank you for that clarification. I had no idea. Every time you come to us, I feel as if I have no education. It's amazing. Can you talk a little bit? And thank you for so much. I always get emotional with you, but thank you so much for telling Sylvia's story. And you said when you find this and this and this, and I know you're a scholar and a researcher, but can you tell us a little bit about what you had to go through to find this woman's story? And thank you so much for telling it.
No, thank you. It's truly my honor to be able to speak about Sylvia and to do the work that I do. It has not been easy, and but one of the things that motivated me initially to write her story was that historical marker where, you know, and
Mhm.
I wish I had put it here, but it's a, did I put it here? No, I don't think so. The historical marker at Weberville completely excludes her. It has John Weber's name and all that he did, and she is listed as, I think, as a former slave. And he married a former slave, and then that's it. That's all she is in that historical marker. When she is the founder of Weberville too, she's the first free Black woman to live in this area. There's so many things they could have highlighted, and I got very upset, and I was like, why is there no biography on her? Why is her name not on there? And that's what made me go do research. And it took me over a year because I kept looking and I kept looking and I couldn't find much. Until I found the Freedom Papers, that was something that allowed me to thread more things and look for more names. Um, and I sometimes one gets lucky. It could have been perseverance. I stayed at the archive when they opened and left when they closed. They had to kick me out. Um, and I kept looking, and I remember one day I almost gave up and I was like, I'm never gonna find anything. Maybe that's why her story hasn't been written because there's nothing. And I remember that very next week, I got this box that it wasn't fully cataloged. And I was like, well, I guess I've checked this. There's like boxes that says some boxes had miscellaneous, Spanish, and sometimes, and that's where those papers were. And I was like, whoa, if imagine if I had given up the week before when I was like, I'm not gonna find anything. then I would have never seen this. And it's not like I found them because somebody had to catalog these records, somebody had to put them there. Many eyes had seen them, archivists, whoever they got them from. And yet, if you go to the archives, a lot of the times, and this happens all the time, you go to archives and you try to look for Black women, they're not cataloged by name, you know?
Mm.
And so now, because of this work, because of the descendants going to the archive, if you go to that archive where I found the Freedom Papers and you search by Sylvia's name, she does come up. But it
Yay.
takes a lot. It took a long time to find this paper. It took me even longer to find a paper where it's proven that they never paid, that they had to forfeit the land. That I didn't find that until 2023. So it's time consuming, and I sometimes I had to like leave stuff hanging, and whenever I can and I have the funds, I'm working now. So it's taken me longer. Like my book is in progress. I haven't finished it because I'm always thinking, I want to make justice to this story, but I know I need more. I know there's more, but I don't have time or the funds to go look for them. So that has been a challenge to be able to have that. Another challenge is when I started, I would go to archives and ask, like for instance, to Mexican archives, I would go and say, "Ooh, I wanna look at any records of runaway slaves that arrived in Mexico." And the archivists would just look at me and say, "We don't have anything here for that." And I was like, "What do you mean you don't?" And so I had to learn how to ask different questions because the archives are not constructed in a way that we can highlight Black women or people who pursued freedom. They're not going to be cataloged, or you can't just type their names and they'll pop up. What I started doing instead, I would go to the archives. Then when I kept getting so many no's, it was very discouraging. But then I was like, okay, how about do you have anything on slaveholders? Do you have anything on Americans? And that's when I started looking at folders of Americans, particularly white, most of them were white Americans. You would see that they either got in trouble or they did something in Mexico as they were trying to kidnap someone who was free. And that's when I started finding the stories because because I had to reframe the questions that I was asking at the archive. Um, I've also encountered a lot of gatekeeping. I remember going to an archive in Texas and I was telling them that I was doing work on people who escaped to Mexico, and they basically told me that they had nothing there. And a few years later, my advisor went, and they did have a lot. Um, and she went with me, and so she had more authority. And she's like, I know there's stuff here, and so they had to show it to us. But initially, some people would just say, no, because they don't want you to write these stories. They don't want you to highlight the stories, especially in this moment we are today. There's a lot that we're not allowed to, well, I'll just say SB1 at Ohio State basically requires us to not teach these histories. Now, that said, I'm
Wow.
still teaching how I teach. I don't know what's going to happen. I haven't been arrested yet. What the consequences of SB1 are, we don't really know. There's not like a force enforcing SB1
Mhm.
in the classrooms, but it's become incredibly hard to do this work in this moment to get funding. We apply for funding, and most of the NEH grants were taken off the table for scholarship like this. Conservative centers were given $5 million, like one we have here in Ohio State. But this part of this work is not getting funded anymore. And so those are the challenges that I'm seeing. But I'm hoping it gets better. And that's the hope we all have, I guess. But
Wow. That is, I I'm not totally shocked, but it's because I know all these things are going on, but it's still shocking that there are so many people that are afraid of the actual history, afraid of showing women that are empowered, afraid of showing people of color that are empowered. and that have contributed to our collective history of the of North America.
Yeah.
It's really a shame. And with that, I just have to tell everybody, um, please request your absentee ballot and vote this year.
Yeah. Vote.
We definitely vote. All Americans abroad can vote in and at home, can vote in the midterm elections. Just go to votefromabroad.org, request your absentee ballot, ask for your ballot to be sent to you by email because the mail coming out of the United States is really slow. And we want it to get to you in time, and then return it electronically if your state allows for you to do that. Everybody can vote, and be sure to tell your friends and family at home and abroad to vote, because this could be our last chance to stop these maniacs who want to destroy our country, who want to destroy the world, and who see us normal people as irrelevant to their plans. So please
Amen,
vote.
sister. Yeah, I always thank Dr. Maria for coming and dropping knowledge, but now I want to thank you for your bravery and your courage and your refusal, like Angela likes to say, don't comply, for your
Yep.
non-compliance to that ridiculousness and still teaching. And I'm concerned for your safety. Has there been anything we push back? You say you're going to wait and see funding. How can we support you as an organization? And are you safe?
Just go vote and help change things. I think that's the most important one. Um, at the end of the day, as an early career scholar, I really don't have any power. I could lose my job anyway, not tenured, you can lose it at any time. So I figured might as well be teaching continue to teach what I teach and what I consider important. I do have a very supportive department, and that has been very wonderful to experience. In spite of that, the institution has not been as supportive, and or the state legislation to that. But the department, my colleagues are phenomenal, and I think they're historians too. They know the past, they know the history, and they say, yeah, we're going to stand together and continue teaching how we teach until we get arrested. And they're like, we can't all get arrested, right? So we're
Well,
hoping that it doesn't get to that, but it's been an eye opener to be in Ohio. I don't know if I mentioned this last time, where when I was in the job market, I didn't apply to any jobs in Texas because I knew the space, I knew the legislature. I never imagined Ohio to be this way, and it's basically Texas 2.0, right? I was very surprised, particularly because I've always thought of Ohio and this borderland as a borderland of freedom, as opposed to Texas, the borderland of slavery. Um, it's been surprising to face
well,
the reality of this space. I still
yeah,
love my department and I love what I do, so I can't, I guess move
yeah.
forward.
I'm from Ohio, and Ohio has really changed over the years. What you said about being a space of freedom, it was more that way maybe 20 years ago, but
Yeah.
now there's just the same amount of maniacs that there are. And in fact, of course, all the House seats are up. The governor election is up. A friend of mine is actually the lieutenant governor position for the Democrats. And of course, we also have the Senate race also.
Yeah.
So please, again, I can't say it enough. You have to vote because everything is riding on this, unfortunately.
It is, and
Um,
I just reminded me. Speaking of Texas, Jasmine Crockett has that primary passed. Angela, we have seven
yeah,
women
they
running
had
for
it
candidates for Senate. Have we
yesterday.
missed those? Okay, so what are the other six states? Do we know? Maybe not off the top of our
Oh,
head,
I can't
but
tell
we
you off
do
the top of
know.
my head,
No.
but there are 36 Senate seats up. So everyone counts. Doesn't matter what Alaska, doesn't matter what state it is. just vote, and let hopefully other people will vote too, and we
Yeah.
can get rid of some of these maniacs because they are ruining our country.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's basically for me, that's what they're doing. They are ruining our country, and we shouldn't have to put up with that anymore. I put a couple of events in the chat. Speaking of slave catchers, we have an event about ICE on March 12th. And we also have an event on becoming financially independent abroad on
Yeah.
March 11th. And if you look on our website, we've got tons of Women's History Month events. They're all going to be wonderful, just like this one was. And I just want to thank you so much, Maria,
Thank
for
you for
joining
inviting
us.
me. I know, and I do have to apologize that sometimes I don't respond. Like these past couple semesters I've had a lot of service. It's been a bit while, so sometimes I don't get to my emails, but I've been very excited to be here. So just so you know, and I hope that when my book comes out, you can host me again with the book.
Oh,
Oh,
So.
wait a minute. Do you have an
100%.
anticipated? Absolutely, that's a date. Do you
So
have an
it's
anticipated month?
it's almost ready, but it should be at least in the process by next by next summer. Hopefully.
You're
That's
welcome
the
back
goal.
anytime. And I don't know
Yes.
if Angela already told you, she wanted you to tell us the real story about Cinco de Mayo. But that's so we
Oh, I
would
would
love to
love
have
to
you
tell
back
you
in
that
May.
story too.
We'd
Okay,
love to
yeah,
have you
because
back in
because a
May.
lot of people don't know the real story of Cinco de Mayo, and they don't understand how important it was for American history and freedom of African Americans. So yeah, we'll definitely for Cinco de Mayo have you
Let me
back.
know. Let me know. Yeah, because I have a
Yeah,
lot to say about that because it's really people don't know the true story.
yeah. All right. Well, ladies, I
I
appreciate
always
both
feel
of you.
good and emotional when I'm with you all. Thank you so much. And I feel excited because I know we'll see Maria again for Cinco de Mayo and when her book launch comes out.
Yep,
Angela, thank you for
yep,
holding
can't
it
wait.
down. Happy
Thank you,
Women
Angela. Thank you,
International
Adrienne.
Women's Month.
Yeah, happy
You
Women's History
too.
Month, everybody. And thank you so much, Maria. Thank you for everybody who attended. And we're gonna say good night now, or good afternoon,
Good
depending on
afternoon.
where you are. And everybody have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All
Bye.
right, bye.